Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Dawn Black, and thank you. Along with Patty Backus, I'm a member of the Board of Directors of the Broadband Institute. I'm very proud to be with you here today for such an important event that's taking place in my hometown, in my home province, British Columbia. It's these events that the ones that bring together ideas and bring people together to share their ideas that I look forward to most of all. But beyond the creativity and the hard work of the broadband staff, the volunteers, and all of our excellent presenters today, it's the support of our allies and our friends that make an event like this actually possible. So it brings me a lot of pleasure to thank the following organizations for their generosity as our very, very valued Progress Summit BC sponsors. So they are the BC Teachers Federation, the British Columbia Professional Firefighters, United Steelworkers District 3, Cavan Advertising, CN Rail, Vision Vancouver, the BC GEU, Move Up. I can't get that one wrong for obvious reasons. The Now Group, Stratcom, the International Association of Firefighters of Canada, C Street and Nation Builder, the IBEW Council of British Columbia, Ernest Ice Cream, and wasn't that yummy ice cream last night? And I've discovered, for those of you in New West, it's available down at the market, down at the quay at Donald's. So Marie and Mark and Alex and David and I, we can get our fill there. And also thanks to the generous partners at Elevato, Quail, and Worth Law Practice. As well, many thanks to our media partners at Care2 and the Tyee. Would you please join with me in giving a hand to all of these wonderful sponsors? On behalf of the Broadband Board and the Institute staff and all the volunteers, I want to thank you for coming with us today, for your participation, and for those of you who are joining us online. Please enjoy the afternoon's program. Thanks very much.
I just want to report on what happened in the self-organizing space on the third floor. A couple of good ideas that came out, one of them in response to Zipporah's challenge around framing. What about having a women's debate in advance of the next provincial election, which could address things from violence against women, childcare, housing. Wow, I'm louder than I expected. Sorry about that. So thank you, Dawn, for that. From the third floor self-organizing room, a couple of comments that came out of there I want to report on. Number one, in response to Zipporah's comment about coming up with framing themes, what about having a women's debate in advance of the next provincial election that could draw together issues of violence against women, childcare, housing, and the social cost of violence? A second comment was around deepening the conversation out of today. It would require a different kind of space and a different kind of meeting design, but it would give an opportunity to have the people that are affected by the things that are being talked about today be involved in the conversation. So the principle of nothing about me without me. So thanks very much for those people that came to have that conversation. So let's get energized now for our next session. I'm going to ask a couple of questions. Did anyone hear anything this morning they found thought-provoking? Put up your hand. Oh, that's pretty good. Do you feel like there's any kind of alignment or broad agreement emerging on what some policy priorities are in the coming months? Not as much, but a few hands. Did anyone get to meet someone new that they hadn't met before? Oh, that's very good. That's a good way to build some networks. And did anyone's conversations at lunch veer into the realm of strategizing wins? Mostly around policy ideas or other? Okay, great. So now for retrieving affordability, progressive policy solutions for BC's housing crisis. And to lead us through that conversation, please welcome David Beers, founding editor of the Tyee and an adjunct professor at the UBC Graduate School of Journalism. David.
Thank you, everybody. I'm very privileged to be attending this wonderful summit. Thank you, Broadband Institute, for doing this and for venturing west with your amazing team. And I have an amazing team of colleagues up here today that I'm going to introduce you to very quickly. I just want to say that while I was sitting here and going over my notes, a politician stopped by. I won't name him, but I said, "How's it going?" He said, "Well, it's pretty good, but it's the view from 10,000 feet." And he was hoping for some tangible solutions, some tangible ideas. And I assured him, I pledged that we are going to produce some tangible ideas here. And I know that because I know that our 3 panelists are in the business of dealing with tangible, real ideas. So I don't want to take up too much time, so let me quickly introduce them. We have, to my immediate left, as you're looking at me, is Margot Young. She's a professor at the Allard School of Law, University of British Columbia, and she was the investigative lead for the Housing Justice Project. So she's knowledgeable in all things legal and housing justice. Then next we have Heather Tremain. Next we have Jackie Wong. And Jackie Wong is, Jackie and I go way back, and I've had the privilege of working with her. She's a brilliant editor and writer. She's written many pieces for the Tyee Solutions Society on housing affordability. She's also an editor at Megaphone. And one of her focuses for the Tyee was rental justice, rental affordability, and she traveled to San Francisco and looked at how things were going there differently, very much wanting to immerse herself in tangible reality. So we'll hear from her on maybe some of that. And then finally we have Heather Tremain, who was a consultant and a fellow at Harvard Fellow in areas of urban design and planning. And she is now the CEO of Options for Homes, which is a brilliant nonprofit that is looking at various ways of sharing the burden of and also the benefits of equity in housing. So she'll be talking a little bit about that too. I want to start off by asking each of our panelists I'm giving each of you just 1 minute. If affordable housing policy in BC, and particularly the Lower Mainland, was a building site right now, where are we in the process of building real affordable housing policy here? Are we at the foundation level? Are we a 20-story tower? Where are we? Shall we start with Heather?
So I would say I have 2 answers to that. One is that I'm coming from the vantage point of affordable home ownership, which is the kind of space that I work in. So I would say we're at the beginnings of an idea of something, really. We don't have a set of drawings yet, really. Or I think the more dramatic answer is that the house is on fire and the fire department's not coming, really. That would be my kind of 2 responses.
The house that we haven't even designed is already on fire.
Our idea house is on fire.
That doesn't sound very good at all. Okay. Jackie, in terms of rental housing, how far along are we in building policy around that?
I think that we're in a spot where we can all see this, this big gaping construction pit, and everybody walks by and they're really curious about it, and some people stop and look at it for a very, very long time quietly to themselves. But there's not a lot going on in this big pit of construction. I don't even know where the blueprints are at this point.
Okay, well, we have lots of opportunity then for tangible solutions in the rental housing building site. So finally, Margot.
Well, I don't have a lot of construction knowledge. So, as I say, I don't have much construction knowledge, so I'm going to muck up the metaphor. But I want to say I think we do have building plans. I think there are a lot of good ideas about possible policies, but we need people to read them and to start building according to those plans. And the one last construction-related conceit is that we need multiple sites to deal with this problem. This is a problem not only about housing supply and demand, but it's also a problem about income. And affordability is a ratio between income and housing costs. So we need to be thinking about foundations in a bunch of different construction places.
Okay, thank you. So now I'd like to ask, I'm going to give each panelist quite a bit more time, a whole whopping 6-7 minutes of your time, to share with us at least 2, maybe 3 tangible solutions that you would suggest to those who are trying to build on those sites. And again, let's start with Heather.
Okay, so I wanted to start by saying, as I mentioned, I work in the space of affordable home ownership, and we deliver housing. Our secret agenda really that we're working on is wealth inequality. So for us, that's actually what's at the heart of housing and affordable home ownership. And I wanted to just kind of frame the issues a little bit. I think, as we all know, housing isn't as simple as just a shelter, a place that you lay your head at the end of the night. But it has all kinds of other pieces attached to it: your status, the security of your tenure. And it's unlike other kind of economic kind of things. There's a supply and demand, but there's also the fact that you actually need this. This isn't a kind of a luxury good. And in Canada, we know that most people's economic and kind of retirement planning is based on the idea that they're going to own a home, that they're going to build equity over time, that's going to help fund, in some part, either it's going to reduce their costs of living, or they're going to. The Globe had an article just recently that 1 in 5 Canadians expect to finance their retirement years out of home ownership, out of selling their home. We also know that homes act as collateral. So when you want to start a new business, I know I did this when we wanted to get a loan. The bank asks you, what assets do you have? And for most people, that's going to be a home of some sort. It helps people finance their kids' educations. There's many things that homes are, and I think we have to think about homes in that bigger context. So that for me is kind of my starting point. And I think we have a couple issues. One is that we don't understand a lot of the issues related to housing. We don't understand the degree of the affordability issues that we face. We don't really have good data. A couple of weeks ago, I was in Ottawa for the National Housing Strategy consultations, and that was the resounding kind of call, was we actually need to understand the issues a lot better than we do right now. And I would say the kind of immediate issue that we see here in BC is really trying to address the speculation in the marketplace. There's my kind of understanding from having spoken to a number of folks who are trying to address this in other areas of the world are that things like the tax, that is where groups like, or cities like Hong Kong have gone, and that's started to impact the market and kind of tame the market. At some level, we need to kind of bring the heat out of this marketplace and reduce the amount of speculation in the marketplace. But also to kind of tighten all the industries around, the kind of finance industry, the real estate industry around those, so that it's actually kind of a collaborative effort. And I think that that's something that going forward is going to have to be addressed, because any other issues, any other kind of efforts, if that's not addressed, is going to be completely undermined, I think. And then I would say on the sort of bigger issues, we need to think about housing as a continuum. A healthy kind of housing market has, from shelter to ownership, and with everything in the between, so affordable rental, some form of subsidized rental, market rental, and in here, some kind of, I would say, market intervention that helps people get into the market, as well as conventional market ownership. And I think we need to really kind of work to provide that solutions across that continuum. And I guess what I see as an affordable homeownership provider is that this is an area where we've been kind of a policy orphan, I would say. There's been lots of work that's now gone into rental, and you can see there's starting to be some good activity here in the rental space, and I applaud that. But I think we need to kind of start, especially in places in in larger markets like Toronto, like Vancouver, where there needs to be this intervention in the marketplace. And I would say the prevailing wisdom has been around, let's deliver more rental. But I think because of all these other kind of issues connected to housing, like people's economic well-being or kind of financial well-being, that I think there needs to be this opportunity for people to own for many other reasons that we, I think as a society, are important. So I think that's, I would say, we need to kind of start to engage more in affordable home ownership.
And Heather, since we've got about 2-3 minutes left, could you talk in some very specific ways in which options for housing specifically is making home ownership more affordable? Some of your financial instruments or whatever, just something really, some takeaways. Yeah.
So we provide a down payment for folks. So we act like a developer, but instead of taking the profits from the projects, what we do is we provide that to someone as a down payment. So it's typically about 15% of the value of the unit. We ask a homeowner to come up with 5%. And so together with our down payment and their 5%, they have 20% equity in their homes. Now, people don't pay anything on that when they own the homes. On our investment, which is preserved as a second mortgage, when they sell the home, they pay that back to us, plus the appreciation on that component. We put that into a fund that we hold separately, and we use that to buy more land and to develop more buildings. So we've in Toronto, we've created 2,500 homes that way, and we'll start another 600 this year. So it's a kind of, we're now self-sufficient as a group. We do really benefit from the contributions of the City of Toronto. So what they do is that they'll waive the development charges they won't waive, they defer the development charges. So they'll provide an additional $25,000 to the homeowner so that gets added onto what we provide to ensure that people have a very significant down payment, and it reduces their principal, their mortgage. So there are ways that we've been quite self-sufficient. There are many of our units where there's no government money in them at all. There are some where there is a government, in effect a loan from government that gets repaid, and those help us deliver kind of deeper affordability. So we're able to deliver homes to families who have incomes as low as $30,000 a year. In the Toronto context, which I recognize it would be very difficult to do that without a lot more support here, but that's what we do in Toronto.
And how you used to live here, so what's the receptivity here at the provincial level and at the city level for this kind of model? Is there an openness to this? Have you tried this idea? Is it working here?
I think to the City of Vancouver, the Vancouver Affordable Housing Agency is in the process of developing an affordable home ownership program, and we've had a number of conversations with them. I would say they're starting to borrow some of the ideas from our model and some other models, and so I think it is kind of, as I said, at that kind of idea stage.
Is there a role at the provincial level for this kind of?
I think there absolutely is. There is, one of the things that we've been really working on is trying to access more capital for equity for projects, not as a loan, but really as equity to help kick off projects. So I think we've actually been lobbying with the other affordable homeownership providers across the country for a federal federal revolving loan fund program that we would say needs to be in the value of around $250 million to support ownership across the country. But we think the province could certainly come to the table and help with that.
Wonderful. Well, I could ask you 10 more questions, but we're out of time right now, but we'll circle back, okay? So, Jackie, Wong, tell us 2 or 3 tangible solutions that you think we are not availing ourselves of here in this part of the world regarding rental.
Sure. So I'm coming from this, based on my work from a while ago. I was working as a housing reporter in Vancouver between 2008 and 2013. And, I tip my hat to those journalists who are in the room now and elsewhere working in Vancouver as housing reporters in 2016, because the conversation, particularly in public conversations and in media, is rife with such racism that it's absolutely appalling. But when I think about the issues that I was seeing coming up again and again with renters and the challenges that they were facing in terms of finding affordable housing, that had a lot to do with the fact that a number of the renters that I met and interviewed and wrote about lacked the kind of financial supports that would get them into a more expensive rental apartment or get them into even striking distance of purchasing a first condo or a starter home, because they just didn't have families that could provide those kinds of supports. They also had very few options for advocating for themselves when it came to things like landlord-tenant arbitrations when they were facing displacement through eviction. When I was first writing about this in 2008, that was kind of when the word rent-eviction was first starting to become kind of a household term in Vancouver. So I have three policy considerations that we could consider for thinking about how lower and middle income renters could perhaps find a stronger foothold here in the city. And one of them is around what we can do to protect vulnerable renters from displacement, and particularly making steps for thinking about how the BC Residential Tenancy Act could change, because it's needed revision for a number of years, but yet we've not seen those changes. Similarly to how we might be inspired by Heather and options for homes in Toronto, we could also first start to look at Ontario's Residential Tenancy Act. It's one of the few provinces in Canada with a provision that doesn't actually allow landlords to include no pet clauses in their rental agreements. Here in BC, a lot of people with animals have a real hell of a time finding rental housing. And also, very importantly, the Residential Tenancy Act in Ontario includes a right of first refusal for tenants who face extensive renovations in their suite. So for some tenant advocates in Vancouver who've been working around things like rent evictions, that clause, that right of first refusal clause, is the solution to the kinds of displacements that people have been seeing here, because here in BC, under the BC Residential Tenancy Act, landlords can evict tenants for the purposes of renovating their suites, but Ontario's allows them to stay in their homes while the renovations take place. Secondly, I found that through my journalistic investigations at least, that there are a number of procedural and administrative inconsistencies in how landlord-tenant arbitrations take place at the residential tenancy branch. So if you are one of the kind of empowered renters who have taken your fight against your landlord as far as the RTB, it's been found that there are a number of inconsistencies, a general lack of procedural fairness there. So it seems that it has something to do with the dispute resolution officers who are working as the people who are convening the arbitrations there. They seem to come from a variety of professional backgrounds, like from the Liquor Control Board and from the gaming corporations and things like that. But I think that here we can take a lot of inspiration from cities like San Francisco, where instead of a whole buffet of folks who are doing this quasi-legal process, administrative law judges, all of whom are lawyers, are convening tenant-landlord arbitrations, and those are all happening in person instead of on the phone at the downtown headquarters of the San Francisco Rent Board. Meanwhile, in BC, most of these kinds of things take place over the phone, and it's a really difficult way to find any kind of equality. The third thing that I think we could think about is we need to address the financial duress that can result from this kind of displacement. So BC tenants could receive better financial supports from the province when they're facing unlawful evictions. And again, we can take inspiration from the city of San Francisco. As all of us know, San Francisco is in no way an affordable city. The tech boom is driving rents up really high. At the same time, they have a very historical population of lifelong renters, and we can learn a lot from that city in terms of the way that policy has played out there, particularly from a municipal level. So there, tenants who are displaced are entitled to relocation payments. The Ellis Act is a hot cause for evictions on par with the rent evictions that we see in Vancouver, down in San Francisco. So that's when a landlord decides to quit their job as a landlord and sell their building off to a developer, and they can kick out all the tenants there. But people who are being evicted under the Ellis Act are entitled to about $5,100 and more for people who are seniors or people who have disabilities. And as well, people who face eviction orders in San Francisco, they get more notice. So they get at least 120 days. People with disabilities and seniors get a whole year's warning, whereas in BC, people are only given 1 month's notice, and they've only been given maybe 1 month's rent to cover the costs of all that moving and displacement.
Are these laws mainly under the purview of the city or the province?
Well, San Francisco's are municipal laws, and then Ontario has a provincial residential tenancy act. Yeah.
When you look across the country when you look across Canada, much less other places, what level of protection do you think renters are afforded in, say, the Lower Mainland compared to the rest of Canada? Do you think we're well protected, relatively speaking, or less?
So interesting. I think that, the first thing that comes to mind is that sort of fantasy of Montreal. For those of you who have lived in Montreal and rented there, it seems like a totally different landscape for renters. Having not lived there personally and having not investigated the tenancy situation there, it seems as though there's just more of a fluid culture of renting, and also importantly a stronger culture of renting. Here in BC and here in Vancouver, renters are consistently treated like second-class citizens, and that's related to the public policy.
Right. Great. Okay. Well, I have to leave it there, but we'll come back probably. Yeah. Margot, do you want to give us some tangible solutions from lower than 10,000 feet?
I'll do my best, but I just wanted to tag on to that last conversation. It's an irony that that's the situation in Vancouver, because we are so importantly a city of renters. 52% of people who live here are renters. Anyway, I'm going to begin at 9,900 feet.
Okay, as long as you're in descent mode, that's all I care about. All right,
but I want to begin by saying that we understate the importance and the political utility of a human rights framework for talking about housing, that there are significant contributions we can get from this framework. And the first is that a right is non-negotiable. So providing adequate housing can't be traded off against other goods when you understand it as a right. And housing is not a luxury good that can be gestured towards by the government when a surplus budget permits or when elections loom. The second thing is that there's a ground floor of provision that's required. So the most marginalized, those most deeply in housing crisis, must get immediate priority. And the last consequence that attaches to understand housing as a right is that there's a demand or the requirement of enforcement and monitoring. And we have these accountability mechanisms at hand, and we can turn them to housing provision if we give it this larger framework. Finally, my 9,000-foot perspective is that it's worth noting that there's no single policy, no one level of government that fixes this problem. A housing policy silo won't adequately address the problem. We need to bring in concerns about the environment, our equality concerns to lend the necessary vigor, depth, and effectiveness to the housing debate. So housing is part of a larger complex of issues of social, economic, and environmental justice. But where does provincial policy then intervene in this broad, complex scenario? So obviously, I would say the first thing the government needs to do as a housing unaffordability solution is address income inequality. And that goes back to my previous comment that affordability is a ratio between available income and housing costs. So our provincial government, as we've remarked throughout today and last night, is stunningly unresponsive to the inequality crisis in this province. We need better social assistance rates, better provision of essential goods, healthcare without a premium attached, quality public universal daycare provision, enhanced investment in education, a better minimum wage, and so on. But the important thing to recognize is that while these are anti-poverty measures, they're also affordable housing measures at the same time. Now, policy that focuses more directly on the housing end of that ratio, or the housing price variable, can involve a number of different policy foci. So for starters, the province needs to invest in new and affordable housing stock. There needs to be a focus, as I said before, on groups that are most marginalized by the current housing crisis. When we understand housing as a human right, it means that in a country and a province as prosperous as ours, the minimum floor of what the state is required to do in observance of this right is high. So I was talking yesterday to the UN Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing, who had just toured through some of the SROs in the downtown east side, and she said that in any other context, like say, for example, if in prisoners were living in those conditions, there would be huge outcry about this as a dire human rights abuse. But somehow we tolerate at some level these kinds of living conditions in our SROs in relation to our housing obligations for, in these cases, those who are most in need of those enforcements. So we need an intensive housing construction program. It should be fueled by provincial funds, and it should focus on social housing for those in core housing need. This week's announcement of $500 million is a good start, but it needs to be more than one-off pre-election, in good times only sort of promise. And as this is rolled out, we need to make sure that the government is spending that money in ways that focus on those in the most extreme housing needs. So building new social housing units, new public housing. So to revive our public housing stock, and actually I would argue to dilute Canada's reputation as one of the most privatized housing systems amongst its comparable nations. So as well, we need to really focus on purpose-built rental stock and on upgrades and maintenance of existing stock. In addition, there are a number of ways to rejig different aspects of the provincial tax system so that we can get some influence on market behaviors that might very well impact housing costs, and again will affect the ways in which our tax systems at both the provincial and federal levels privilege homeowners over renters. So for example, the homeowner grant is available independent of income, as is its deferral once you reach 55. We could change that. We could have it be more progressive and benefits based not on home ownership alone, but importantly on income. This brings me, I'm sorry, I'm going back to 9,000 feet, but I really think it's important to think creatively about the kind of housing stock that we build in this city. We need to examine this notion of home ownership as the central ambition of one's life course. And I say that hypocritically because I own my home, so I understand that I sit in a compromised position on this issue. But we associate a home perhaps too quickly and easily with home ownership. If regulatory structuring of rental housing looked more like some of those things that we value in home ownership, security of tenure, guaranteed maintenance, for example, then long-term rental might be more attractive, and it might displace somewhat or work in more effective tandem with this idea of home ownership as a clear policy preference. So the contributions that you've just made, Jackie, I think are really important to this. And I would add as well, I just recently read about a jurisdiction that now gives legal aid on eviction. So one of the complaints of United Nations human rights monitoring bodies of Canada, and this would be of BC as well, is that you can evict people into homelessness. And part of the right to adequate housing is understood to provide a guarantee against eviction into homelessness. Well, we can think about this at the provincial level. We can think about extending legal aid so that you get a lawyer when you're evicted. And again, that's another illustration of the different sites for provincial policy that all will bear on making less critical the housing circumstances that we have in this province. So certainly equal access to home ownership should concern us, but we need to think creatively about other forms of adequate housing, focus on a variety of home ownership options as well. Townhouses, not simply those large homes surrounded by gardens that take up so much valuable land in this city right now. And this, of course, ties into an environmental debate about urban density and a debate as well about inclusivity in this city. So I want to end then with one last caution, and I think, Jackie, again, I'm going to play off something that you said in your presentation. I am very concerned about how the conversation around foreign buyers and foreign money is playing out in Vancouver at the moment. Focus on capital flows from, say, mainland China into Vancouver's real estate market really operates to the exclusion of tough conversations about other places where money in the market comes from, and this includes Vancouver and Canadian residents. Too often this conversation spins into something that is, I think, quite simply racist. It's about who's coming to Vancouver, who's living here, about neighborhood composition and change, who's to blame for the high housing prices. So when we have a public discourse that involves, just simply counting the number of students and homemakers who are on property title documents, that raises for me both race and gender concerns in how we're structuring this conversation. So I think leadership on the housing crisis in Vancouver and more broadly in this province and country has to focus on directly on the problems of speculation, property flipping, property used as an investment, not as a home, about vacancy, about gentrification, not on the nationality of owners and sellers behind these market behaviors and residential property uses.
Thank you very much. So now I want to, all right, okay. I want to very quickly come back to the panel with two provocative questions. If you choose not to answer the question, that's fine. Hopefully one of your colleagues will up here on the panel. First one is that, I recently surveyed the prescriptions coming from both from Professor Davidov at UBC, who styles himself a libertarian. I know that I'm not labeling him that because he willfully took on that mantle when he took on half of a debate that I moderated a while back. And then Mark Lee, who would not call himself a libertarian, I guess he'd call himself a progressive at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Anyway, I looked at both of their prescriptions. I wrote a piece about it in the Tyee. And one of the things that came out was both of them, they had slightly different versions of it, but they both were supply-siders. They both felt that a lot more units just simply needed to be built, not just by the government, but through market mechanisms, and that increased supply would produce more affordable housing. I just want to ask the three members of the panel if you agree with that we need to somehow do what we can to, whatever it takes at the policy level, to encourage a lot more building, a lot more density, if you will, in the Lower Mainland, and if that would produce affordability. Shall we start with Heather? Or no, I'm sorry, I don't want to name people because I already said you conduct the question if you want. Jackie wants at this. Go, Jackie.
Now you've set me up for something. Well, I think that's a really interesting question, because that's a huge question that people are asking all the time. Like, why don't we just jam the city with more, more beautiful one-bedroom apartments, right? And so I think that this is a complex question that needs more nuance. I think about a sustainable transportation advocate named Gil Peñalosa, who's a man who I had a chance to meet and interview a few years ago. And he's a former park commissioner for the city of Bogota, and these days he talks about how we can try to make cities more sustainable in terms of car-free transportation, making it safe for people ages 8 to 80 years old. He's famously talked about how we have to stop building cities as though people are 30 years old and athletic. I think that we have to apply similar logic to the way we think about housing here in Vancouver. We have to stop building housing, making this kind of supply as though everybody is 30 years old and gainfully employed and moving,
the one bedroom apartment with the laundry room / office.
And I think that it's a weird time in this city. It feels as though Upwardly mobile, upper middle class professionals are dominating a lot of conversations about real estate these days. And unfortunately, of course, that's only a very particular demographic. And I think that illustrates how housing in this city is very much tied not only to income, but to social capital. And that's something that we see a lot in both the mainstream, real estate market, in rentals, in co-ops, where people that get truly affordable housing that works for them, they tend to be the kind of people who largely occupy this room, people who are well-connected professionals, people who are native English speakers, people who can kind of win the charms of a landlord or really ace a co-op application because they can talk all this amazing, social justice language and have people accept them. But then I think the housing affordability challenge, and that's where I don't know if the supply question answers it, is how we can shift public policy to more strongly reflect the needs of people who don't fit that profile, the people who don't have the social capital to game the system.
Excellent. Anybody else want to speak to this question of how do we create a lot more product, and if that would in our old-fashioned macroeconomics 101 class would increase supply, meet demand, and lower the cost?
So I would agree. I think supply is a part of the equation. I think, as I mentioned, it needs to be, all the way along the continuum. And I think we have to think about where should the investment be. So if we are talking about public dollars, there should be more investment at the kind of shelter and kind of the kind of beginning of the housing spectrum, if you will, as well as kind of in the rental spectrum. But I think, and some enabling on the affordable home ownership side, and really a lot of the, we act as conventional developers in many ways. So we go out and get municipal approvals and build buildings, but sell them as a nonprofit. But honestly, the approval process is incredibly difficult and long. It takes us 4 to 5 years to get an approval on a building. This is Toronto, but it's not that different in Vancouver, and that really does constrain the supply. I'm not sure that you're going to bring down the housing prices, but at least you can kind of... So
you're saying some of the things that constrain the supply of market expensive housing also constrain the supply of nonprofit affordable housing, and that could be eliminated. Okay.
Yeah, I think the other thing that I would also say is when you have these pinch points in the system, like there hasn't been new rental in the system, or there's this big gap between people getting into the market. When you have constrained supply at those points, it pushes the whole pressure down the system.
Right.
So that, if you can't get into affordable rental, then I can remember, I've been away from Vancouver for 2 years, but I can remember, and it might have been in the Tyee, folks, articles on people who are kind of maybe moderate income folks starting to move into the downtown east side and SROs that were, because that was where they could afford to live. And that just kind of pushes increasing pressure onto folks and ultimately results in homelessness for people. So I think we do have to have supply all the way along the system. We have to think of it as a housing
ecosystem, and each category of critter in the ecosystem is affecting the others.
They need some space.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, and then Margot, very quickly, do you have anything to add, or do you think it's well covered?
2 things to add. The first is, I think, a difference between Tom and Mark is who's going to do the building. So Tom Davidoff really is in favor of leaving it up to the market and argues for just radical opening up with basically no zoning limits anywhere in the city, and then see what kind of density he thinks you would get. Density, but what kind of density you get. I think Mark, and Mark's right there, so I hope I'm getting you right, Mark.
Where's
talks
Mark?
A bit more
there he is.
about
hey, Mark.
Government and non-profit provision, but I certainly agree that there are a range of other considerations, that it's not just supply writ large that we need, and
especially
these two have
if
talked
supply
about that.
is, if land is limited and supply is hooked up to a very large pool of capital beyond the borders of the lower mainland, and I'm specifically saying that rather than the borders of our country, then it could take a long time of building supply. You might actually build so much supply that the place is not recognizable whatsoever, and still not have met, the demands of that's out there, right? So I feel like that's where policy does come in. I think we are facing kind of an odd version of market failure here, personally. I won't give you my second question. I'll just make it an observation because I want to be able to get on and get the audience involved. But the observation was that this came up in the debates that I moderated last year, the urbanarium debates. Davidoff said this in the article I wrote recently. Density is such a hot button political issue. It is so hard for local politicians to advocate for intensive densification within their own borders. It's almost a career ender. Davidoff was saying it's the job of the province. The job of the province actually has a lot of control over the charter of Vancouver, as Councillor here would tell us. Davidoff was proposing that it should get quite interventionist and actually get in there and mandate new density levels within the city boundaries, and that would be a fascinating political moment if that ever came to pass. But it's really kind of where this is going, right? As you have people advocating density as the solution. We've got two questions around that. Is it really? Because we've just kind of expressed some doubts about that, market-driven density. Is it the solution to affordability? And secondly, if it is, who's going to take the political hit on that? How is that going to happen equitably and fairly? So I want to just very quickly summarize some of the points that came out, and then we'll get the audience involved. So first of all, Heather asked us to reflect on what is a home. It's more than shelter. It's also, in this particular political economy, it represents equity for people. It represents also collateral. So it's really kind of a bargaining chip in a capitalist economy. Secondly, she pointed out that any change that's going to happen is going to happen through collaboration from all the kind of Venn diagram sectors that go into creating affordable housing. And so that would be financial, that would be the building developers and trades, and that would be government policy. I'm guessing that if you were to diagnose the health of that collaboration going on right now, you could say there's a lot more room for improvement in this part of the world. The reason I love having Heather here is I just think that Options for Housing has this brilliant hack, this way of looking at it that we hardly ever talk about, which is no matter how cheaply or efficiently or high or densely you build a building, there's still land underneath it. Land in this part of the world is very expensive and limited. Therefore, land is equity, and equity needs, under their model, it needs to be shared. There needs to be more than one partner in owning the equity of the land. Sometimes Van City has a project like this. It might be a government. It might be a trust. But we really have to start looking at these equity sharing policies, because simply building cheaper and higher is not going to get it done. Also, from Jackie's perspective, she pointed out that a whole collection of what I would call renters' rights measures, we're not cutting edge on that here. We may have dense, livable urban design that's state of the world. That may be what Vancouverism is, but we don't have Vancouver renterism. The world is not coming here to admire how well we stick up for renters in this part of the world. There's a lot of room for political policy making in that regard. Margot kind of picked up on that theme by pointing out that housing really must be looked at as a human rights issue, and I think that is an area where progressives they're just more open-minded about that. They're more willing to think that way. They're less willing to leave it to the market necessarily. And if we're going to intervene in the market, then it's best, I think, to intervene along the principles of shoring up and protecting human rights rather than favoring one group over another or quieting down one noisy group at a time, right? So if housing is a human rights framework and not necessarily then it's not necessarily just should be looked at as a consumable or a luxury, but it's a right. And then from there, Margot pointed out that income equality is therefore very much linked to affordability, and that social supports are what you might call the social income. So it's not just how much cash arrives in your bank account via your job and maybe some government payments, but it's also the social supports that allow you to meet your bills. Everybody's in favor of investing in new affordable housing stock, and I think Heather pointed to the place where she'd like to see most of that investment, and that's sort of at the social housing level and at the low-income housing level, the shelter for the homeless level. And I think she very aptly pointed out that that is not just some noblesse oblige thing that you do for some people who are unfortunate. It ripples up the ladder or across the spectrum, because housing is a spectrum. I thought Margot made an excellent point that it's really meaningless to throw money at affordable housing in a year when it's a super hot issue. In fact, the horse is pretty far out of the gate. It's pretty meaningless to throw even hundreds of millions of dollars at it, as our premier promised to do, if it's the sort of thing you do when, hey, we have a surplus. Maybe we should spend some of that on housing. We've just heard housing, affordable housing, building a built, livable landscape takes so much planning. It takes so much risk assessment. You need to understand the landscape extending before you 5, 10, 15 years to get anything built. So the fact that the premier this year, but maybe not next year, is willing to invest some money here and there is not the same as having a long-term commitment, a policy commitment, to investing a certain amount year over year in sectors of housing. We don't have that right now. And finally, looking at the regulatory structure, building more regulations around a housing justice ethos. And that means basically realizing that injustices are occurring every day in very quiet, out-of-the-way places whenever a renter is told they have to go. So we need to tool up renters with legal representation. We need to build in regulations that allow them to stay in their home while it's being renovated. That sounds really fun, but nevertheless, it's better than being kicked out. And finally, compensation. If this is going to happen, if we live in a Jane Jacobs world where neighborhoods change all the time, and that's the life of a city, lives are cities are constantly changing. If we're going to acknowledge that, then we need to make the second statement, which is we're going to compensate people who are caught up in that chaotic change. That's just part of the cost of doing business. If real estate is so expensive and precious and such a, at this point, a revenue generator for government in this part of the world, then some part of that should go to the people who are being chewed up in the gears. So that's what I heard today on the panel, and now I'd like to open it up to the audience. And what I would invite you to do is, rather than make a speech, even though we love to hear speeches, instead of making a speech, I'd like to hear an yes and or a yes but statement. You know, acknowledge something that was said up here, and then bring your expertise, because we have tremendous expertise in this room. Bring your expertise, your experience to bear on some of the proposals that were floated up here. So who would like to go first? And Alejandra will do the, so that I will never be blamed later for playing favorites. Alejandra will take on that risk. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thanks. Yes, and so I like what was said around race and around renters being second-class citizens. I just a couple. Yes, and let's talk about NIMBYs in neighborhoods and so-called progressives who oppose density. You touched on that, David, a little bit, but I'd like to flesh that out a little bit more. So people that are opposed to density in their neighborhoods, specifically around affordable housing and social housing. So we're all talking about how it's a human right and we need this, but then you have neighborhoods where people are opposed to just this kind of housing supply increased in their neighborhood. You know, we've all seen those, and people in this room will know I've worked on some of these projects, but projects around Commercial Drive where people don't want tiny rental, new 8-unit buildings. They don't want that additional density in their neighborhoods. And a lot of these folks are again, so-called progressives. And I think it's an elephant in the room. It's a class issue. And I think it's something that we need to address head on if we're going to get past this, because I do personally believe supply has to be part of the answer.
Can we go take a few more?
Absolutely.
Great. Go ahead, please. Well, looks like it's not working. Do you want to use your neighbors if possible? Switch. Thank you.
I'm gonna stretch. Okay, thanks. So my name is Mark Lee, and I just wanted to say yes, but to David's comment. I mean, to me, like, if there's a political slogan that's gonna come out of this, it would be something like, the housing stock of Vancouver should be owned by the people who live and work in the city. And that means we should be open to immigrants who come here and want to live and work and play with us. But that we do actually, if we're going to make housing a human right, as Margot eloquently suggested, we do need to have a more rational management of both the demand and supply of the housing market. So, I think there are very legitimate concerns about external capital, not necessarily Chinese capital, but it could be American or Toronto or Albertan capital, propping up the extremely high price inflation we've seen in the housing market, and that's something that we should be opposed to. But on the supply side, I would argue that we've actually been building a lot in recent years, but we're not building the right type of housing for the right folks. If it's purely left to the market, it makes a lot of sense for developers to build luxury condos to sell to the super rich from wherever they may live. Instead, my building program is more along the lines of 5,000 to 10,000 new units per year that are dedicated rental stock, that are seniors affordable housing, that is housing the homeless. So there are a lot of things where we have so much catching up to do that we could essentially build this out for a generation, and it's going to take a generation of doing that to basically restore some semblance of affordability. I think there's no easy fix that's going to change this over the course of a year. But the key idea is, how do you lock in affordability over the long term? And that comes back to that idea of making sure that we're not taking housing as an investment, but as a place to live. So dedicated, purpose-built rental is going to avoid the problems we see around rent evictions. A lot of that's coming in the condos and secondary suites as opposed to the dedicated purpose-built rental. So we need to build more of that. I really love the idea of community land trusts. Again, this equity sharing that David mentioned, where you're taking the land out of the equation and you're putting constraints on the resale of that, so that you're essentially making that house ownership, but that's locked in over the long term. And that's the type of approach I think we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about a rational management of housing for the future. So thanks. Sorry, I've gone on
thank
too
you.
long.
How many more hands?
I just want to add that Mark authored a fantastic policy prescription report in the spring, and it's on the CCPA website, and have a look at that. Yeah.
Okay, we have right now 1, 2, 3 more hands. Is that total? Great. Why don't we go over there to the mic, please? You're on.
Oh, can I? Yes, I guess you can. Yes, but I work at the Surrey Urban Mission on Saturday, where we feed people, and I talk to an awful lot of people about that. And one of the things that I keep hearing is, everybody who gets up in the morning and goes to work should have a place to live, but not the homeless. They do not work. It would have to come free. They're not entitled to it. They made their own decisions. And I find this just appalling. And I've had a suggestion for a long time, which has apparently been used in Chicago, where whenever a building is built, if it's over a certain number of floors, then the city buys 2 or 3 of the complexes and gives them at a reasonable rate to the homeless. But everything I hear from my friends is, and from the builders, you won't get anyone to buy the rest of the suites. So I think the yes but is, by all means, the people who work should have a place to live, but Thank you.
Margot, do you have a response to that? I mean, what do you think is the state of kind of our political culture? Are we sort of still locked in some kind of Dickensian obsession with the worthy poor or the deserving poor, or is there more room than we might have heard right there for?
I think we are. I think we are still locked into it. Although I have to say that anti-poverty advocates have done a great job attacking that, but I don't think that perspective has sort of filtered more broadly into the mainstream. And I think the idea that people who live here should be in the residential, in housing here is a really powerful idea. I don't think you meant this, Mark, but I'd be careful with too easy a use of the term live and work here, because I think, in fact, it's a broader range of people we want to make sure have access to housing. But, of course, this notion of desert fuels and structures our social assistance program, how we treat the homeless through the housing supplement, or what we tolerate for the living conditions for those people who are most marginalized.
And are there places in the world where a political consensus through, mobilization and working with successful policies has kind of created a different consensus that you look to?
I think there are places in the world that don't have the same problems around poverty and homelessness, for sure. And I think what it requires is greater political tolerance for redistribution of resources and for that redistribution across a number of policy sites as well.
Okay.
So, one over here, Farah, and then I had another hand here. Oh, great. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Farah Ashraf, and I just wanted to say yes and. I talked earlier about education being a determinant of health. Housing is a really, really well evidence-based determinant of health. We know that housing is foundational to people being in good health. People who don't have housing have a whole host of health problems. That's been very, very well researched in Canada. And people in precarious housing have a whole host of health problems. Canada has a national problem with mold in our housing, which causes a lot of other respiratory tract problems and other things like that. We've also got good evidence to show that if we were able to house most of our unhoused or precariously housed people, that we'd save millions of dollars in our acute care system. Because whenever people have a housing problem that leads to a health problem, they end up in the hospital. So there's a really, really good economic argument to be made to be housing people well in order to save money in our healthcare system, which unfortunately is eating everybody's lunch right now. Healthcare is just costing us far too much money in this country. So if we can save money in acute care by doing something really proactive like building good housing, the math is actually really pretty watertight. The other thing that I find really scary as a Canadian and as a Vancouverite is that some of my colleagues at UBC have done some really long-term, longitudinal research looking at neighborhoods where children grow up in and how a child at age 5, when tracked for the next several years of their lives, if they come from a neighborhood which in our city is considered a deprived neighborhood, can be predicted to do worse in almost every measure of their well-being. So our division in our own city has become so unequal that it's becoming a predictor of what kind of jobs people get, what kind of health they're going to get, whether they're going to interact with the criminal justice system or not. This is a really acute and serious problem. And finally, I just want to say that the UN Special Rapporteur on housing, which I think one of you mentioned, a few years ago came out and said that housing is not only a problem in BC and Vancouver, it's a national crisis. When I was writing the public health plan for the government of Nunavut, Iqaluit, I heard, has a huge crisis in housing. So is it possible that we could push our federal government to try to have a national housing plan? And could we do something at the national level? Because clearly our government in this province isn't doing enough, particularly with things like ALR land. Like, I think that's a really serious problem, that we're losing the possibility of our food security because of the pressure on housing.
Great.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Chris.
And you provided some great talking points for our friend who spoke earlier when she runs into the naysayer at her shelter, right? Yeah.
Chris, go ahead.
Hi, Chris Coleman, Vancouver Firefighters. I want to talk the point I heard about less than ideal prison conditions in the SROs in the downtown east side. And if you think how rezoning a single-story bakery in Chinatown to 12 stories of residentials with Starbucks as an anchor tenant, how that helps accessibility to SROs or affordable housing, and how the relocation of St. Paul's with the inevitable move of doctors and nurses who want to be close to work, and the relocation of pharmacies and specialist office, how's that going to help access to SROs and affordable housing?
So is that a question you're putting to the panel, or is that a rhetorical question to make us all realize that?
I would love an answer, an opinion, or a thought. Sure.
Okay. Go ahead. Yeah.
So 2 responses. First, in relation to the comment about it was Maloon Kathari, who was a former special rapporteur on housing, who said that Canada has a national housing crisis, and he paid particular connection to housing in the north for Inuit communities, and that segues into an important point, which is that there is a significant part of this issue that needs to have an Indigenous focus and consciousness about it. The second response I would have is I just recently read about a new municipal policy introduced in San Francisco when redevelopments take place in a neighborhood that has a distinctive character to it, either a cultural, a racial, or I guess a class or socio-economic character. There's now a municipal bylaw that requires that a significant percentage of the new development has to have in it people from the neighborhood. They have to house the people who used to live there, who live in that neighborhood, so that you don't see new developments displacing and you don't get this problem that we know as gentrification.
Great. We have a couple of minutes left. Is there anybody with a burning question? Or perhaps we can, oh, please go ahead. And then after that, just some brief concluding remarks so we can go into our break.
Yeah, so I guess it's a yes, but you're saying Professor Davidoff was libertarian, but I think it's good to get ideas from broad spectrum. You know, and to the point on the racial issue around housing, and now we've got it based on nationality. I think he had an idea for if your income was below a certain point, or your taxes paid federally, provincially, you know, income taxes. That also then looks at us if you're a resident, working, and whatnot. Should we look more at that? You know, now that the government's getting sued, class action lawsuit on this 15%, maybe should they revisit something like that?
I can't really talk to the details of that lawsuit because I haven't really figured them out yet, but it is, I think, a charter challenge. So the argument is that the 15% tax is unconstitutional on division of powers, that it actually lies within the federal government's jurisdiction, and also that it's an infringement of equality rights. But so that's a new wrinkle as these things roll out.
Great.
There we go. I just want to agree with you. I mean, the reason that Professor Davidoff was in my piece is that I thought his ideas were quite interesting and worth hearing, and you can go find that piece on the Tyee. And I think that what Professor Davidoff and Mark Lee and other people are saying is that the foreign buyers tax is it makes for kind of sensational headline fire quenching politics. Does feed in, it can feed into this racist discourse we're talking about, but that the real issue is, and this is I think what Mark was saying when he said people who live and work or are long-term citizens here should be the ones who we're concerned with housing. Point is, like, as you're saying, is, you know, there are a lot of ways to get around this foreign buyer tax. And it doesn't really put a finger on somebody who, as you pointed out, might be paying extremely low income tax, and somehow they own a very expensive house, and they pay very low. We have relatively low property taxes here as well, right? So we didn't even get into the issue of property taxes being relatively low, and that you could create a much more progressive form of property taxation and roll some of those revenues back into creating paying for some of the housing that we want to that we want to have the government fund, right? And I think that was also in Mark's report. So I do want to acknowledge that we have to listen to all sides, and good ideas can come from any direction, and then we can have our debates about how to fine-tune and tweak them and incorporate them into a progressive agenda, which is what this summit's about. But I really welcome your point to not seem to be censoring any point of view.
Great. Thank you so much, and I'm going to thank Heather, Jackie, Margot, and David for guiding us through this thoughtful deliberation on policy solutions. But to take us out on this topic, I'm going to give the word to Ed Broadbent.
Thank you. I was waiting to see if someone would raise the question about the national government responsibility, because it is. You know, Margot is right. We, the federal government, signed on to the Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and there's both a federal government obligation and a provincial government obligation in terms of enforcing that right. Secondly, if you look back to the early 1970s, the Scandinavian countries, of all places, were coming to Canada to look for what should be done about housing. In the early 70s, we had all kinds of injection of national capital going out for co-op housing, and a lot of co-op housing built in this city in that period, non-profit, subsidized mortgage rates for low-income Canadians. A whole plethora of housing programs emanated from, guess where? Ottawa. There was national leadership on the question, and I give a guy named Trudeau Sr., some credit, another guy, Ron Basford from Vancouver, and I happened to be a housing critic for the NDP at that time, and the Liberals actually did listen. We cooperated together to create, amongst others, some of the most imaginative, affordable housing of anywhere in the world. And then, guess what? Both the Liberals and the Conservatives got the national government out of housing. So there's none now. I think last time I checked, we're the only developed industrial democracy without a national housing strategy. So there should be one. I saw that the mayor of Vancouver recently announced donating a lot of land to be used for affordable housing. Well, I can tell you the federal government has thousands of acres of federal land right across the country. It could make that available, and you could set up nonprofit trusts in that land. You could have co-ops, you could have other kinds of low-income housing. What's needed at the national level is some imagination and some political will, and it should be there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ed. That's a great reminder. And thank you to our panel, so let's give them a round of applause. But I think that Ed's words are a great reminder about how important political will is, and therefore really the imperative for action and for change in this province, not just action at the federal level, Ed. And that's exactly what we're going to be considering after our break. It's the campaign map to win.